AP debated the other goober Trent last night, and it was a disaster. That guy said that he believes that Jews are automatically saved. He says that at one point. He says Muslims have the gospel. Kid you not. So, I mean, totally vindicated on the insanity of this other guy. But again, Trent Horn is not much better. Trent Horn, as his other Catholic co-religionists point out, is actually a feminist. So we're talking about a feminist Roman Catholic apologist whose wife degrades and makes fun of him publicly, and admitted on a podcast that she fell in love with another man at her workplace. Again, cucking Trent publicly. I say that not to be mean, but to point out that the people that we're dealing with, especially in this sphere, usually, not in the case of Tim Gordon. Tim Gordon's a pretty stout, buff dude. I think he would probably beat me up in a debate. The other dudes, for the most part, the rest of the sphere, low T and soy. So that's another element of problem that's going on with a lot of these weird, slimy, passive-aggressive theology nerds. And the Roman Catholic world is full of that. That's why Benedict enjoys the gay acrobats at the Vatican. So let's get into it. Let's hear Trent's arguments. He's going to convince us that Muslims, Christians, and Jews maybe do or do not. Let's see what he says.
So there's been a lot of discussion online related to the question, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? The discussion was spurred on by a debate on the Tim Pool podcast and a debate on Capturing Christianity, where the Eastern Orthodox guest used it to argue that Catholicism is false. I wasn't planning on addressing this issue.
The Eastern Orthodox guest. Trent doesn't want to use my name, even though we've already had a debate together. My name is becoming like, in David Lynch's Dune, a killing name. Muad'Dib is a killing word. So Trent doesn't want to say it, even though obviously he knows who I am. That to me is funny. By the way, if you want to support the stream, you can do so via Super Chats right there. So let's see what else Trent has to say.
Because my colleagues Joe Heschmeyer and Jimmy Akin have already addressed this question on their own channels, and I try not to address topics other people have already covered. But I got a lot of requests to talk about it, and there are a few arguments that I can offer that complement what Joe and Jimmy have already said. And there's also some objections that have come up since then.
By the way, Jimmy Akin is the guy who says that Nestorius wasn't an Nestorian, and in one of the video clips he says that we now know Arius wasn't as bad either. So that's what you're getting from these goobers.
That I can address. So let's jump right in. First, I want to be clear that I don't like the phrasing, Muslims and Christians worship the same God. That sounds like we're saying the God of Christianity and the God of Islam are identical in all respects, which is false.
Yeah, but that's the language that your Vatican II documents use, Trent. Do we need to rehearse this again? Lumen Gentium 16. Along with us, they worship and adore the one merciful God. Or they adore, excuse me. They value the moral life and worship capital G God. Same God. They adore the one true God. So Trent's initial objection right away is admitting that, quote, he doesn't like the term, but the term is his own church's term. So now Trent knows better than the Vatican II documents. And I would add that thank you to Let's Talk God, who found the meeting with the young Muslims that we read in last night's stream from John Paul II in 1985, where he says even stronger wording and terminology than Vatican II's documents about worshiping, loving, and serving the same God as Muslims. So Trent does not care, apparently, what his own popes and magisterial teachings say. Trent knows better.
False. The Christian God is a trinity of three distinct divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The God of Islam is, in contrast, a single, infinite person who has other different attributes, though both concepts also have many overlapping attributes as well. It is silly, though, to say Islam does not worship the true God, though, simply because Muslims call God Allah. Allah is the Arabic word for God.
Nobody here has made this argument.
It's the same word Arabic-speaking Christians use when they refer to God, so the name Allah isn't the main issue. But I still don't think it's prudent to make the claim Muslims and Christians worship the same God. You can show that claim is true, but you have to qualify it.
No, you can't actually show that is true, because as we saw in multiple streams and multiple responses, worship is a very specific theological term. And the way that that God is worshipped will be dependent upon how that God says he has to be worshipped. For example, a Muslim does not believe that a Christian worships the same God as him, because from the Muslim vantage point, we are idolaters for having icons, images, or thinking that Jesus is divine. So in their perspective, for example, it's not the same God because the worship is not accurate. It is polluted with idolatry, and therefore it is vain and unacceptable worship. And this is why it's forced so many Roman Catholics this week, when we bring this up, to argue that God accepts even the worship of pagans, because pagans, according to Acts 17, believe in and worship one God. No, they don't. In fact, that is not what Paul is saying. So let's take a look at that, because I brought that up today on Twitter. There was a syncretist guy who had a comment saying that all the religions worship the same God, basically making a Freemasonic statement. And he was getting like 2,000 likes and shares. And so I replied to him, no, Paul does not say that pagans worship the one true God, because in Acts 17 he says, the one that you worship without knowing. The point of the passage, even using the rhetorical example of having an idol to an unknown God, is that that's the one that's the true God, the one you don't know. He's not saying that they actually know and worship that God in any sense, in any true sense, because Paul also says explicitly, qualifying that in Romans 1, the pagans exchange the truth of God for a lie and worship and serve the creature rather than the creator. In Paul's mind, it's either or. You don't worship demons, but also worship God. You don't worship God through worshiping a demon. You don't worship God at all when the sacrifices of the pagans are offered to demons and not to God, 1 Corinthians 10:20. So this immediately refutes the nonsense that just because Acts 17 says that there's an unknown God, or that Paul cites a pagan poet, that he's equating the worship. Those two passages right there tell you that Paul clearly does not mean that, both from Paul. So Roman Catholics, though, don't care that the other passages explain and qualify what Paul means. They just want it to be any worship is accidentally, indirectly, somehow getting to the triune God. If that's the case, there's no such thing as idolatry. There is no longer false idolatrous worship, because every worship, every veneration passes on to God in some generic, elastic, lowest common denominator sense. But as we know from Scripture, God insists many, many times over that he must be worshiped the way he lays down. If you go back to the time of Moses, when God gives Moses this pattern of liturgical worship with all of these specifications and all of these iconographic things like the imagery within the temple and the showbread and the incense and the brazen sea and the Ark of the Covenant with the seraphim on it and the Holy of Holies, all of this ornate, elaborate imagery is very particular and very precise. And even in that dispensation, I'm not saying dispensationalism, that dispensation, when someone who did know and worship the true God did it in a way that was not appropriate, that is rejected. So Nadab and Abihu, being in the covenant and knowing the one true God, worshiping him in a creative, made-up way in Leviticus, results in them being killed and their worship being vain and not accepted. How much more so outside of the church, outside of the covenant people, would the vain, superstitious worship of the pagans be to a demon and not to God? This is the kill shot for this stupid perennialist argument. Clear as day. Now, and let's do another reminder, because people apparently don't know that Islam is a religion like Judaism that is predicated on Unitarianism and the explicit rejection of Trinity and deity of Christ. Therefore, they do not love, adore, or worship the triune God. Therefore, as John says, whoever denies the Son, Muslims and Jews, does not have God the Father. Therefore, they do not have access. Their worship is not accepted. It is vain and superstitious.
Otherwise, people will think that you're committing religious indifferentism. It's sort of like the claim Catholics worship Mary. That claim is true, but it has to be qualified so people don't think you're committing idolatry. Catholics give Mary the respect she is worth. They give Mary her worthship, since Luke 1:48 says all generations will call Mary blessed. But Catholics do not give Mary honor that is due to God alone. Likewise, Muslims and Christians both worship God, but Muslims and Christians don't offer God the same kind of worship. And when we look at the question in this way, we can find clarity amidst disagreement. What makes this...
But the point is that you can only worship God the way that God lays down. That's why, for example, in 1 Corinthians, Paul castigates the church at Corinth for polluting and messing up the divine liturgy and the Eucharist by doing it in an irreverent way, and thus them bringing upon themselves a potential death sentence by eating and drinking unworthily. Just like Nadab and Abihu, eating and drinking unworthily makes the worship worthless and vain, even within the covenant. Thus, outside of the covenant, it is not really proper at all to think of worship in a true sense, other than the way that Roman Catholics are doing it, to retool the word to make it mean an assent mentally to propositions of the magisterium or to propositions that Muslims, Christians, and Jews hold in common. So in other words, it's a stack it up sort of, let's go from the bottom up and say, okay, well, look, we believe in one God. It's an eternal being. It's a first cause. Those are in common, so isn't it therefore the same referent? As Father Deacon showed in the original debate, or the second debate, the way that we go about explaining a type of deity or a thing that is not a natural object, it's more like a set of things. And if you remove any one thing, you don't have the same set anymore. So it's like the same with the attributes of God. If I start listing divine attributes and I remove one of them, even if I have the other 9 correct, it's a different referent now, because I'm saying that I worship the God that is these 9 attributes, but not the 10th attribute of being omnipresent. For example, Muslims do not believe that God is omnipresent. I don't know if Trent knows that, but Allah is not present in time and space. He does not come down into time and space. So he's not omnipresent the way that we think. Allah also is a deity that creates and destroys creation at every millisecond in a occasionalist sense. So creation and creator doesn't mean the same thing as a Christian. Thus, even the attributes that many people think are, quote, in common, that would somehow make it a common referent, a common deity, are actually not common. Their words are similar, but the meanings given to the words are completely different. But really, all of natural theology hinges on a word concept bait and switch. And that's exactly what Trent and I debated. And that's why most people believe that Trent lost the debate, even Roman Catholics, because Trent taught that The Old Testament is a Unitarian revelation, and it's not a revelation of the Trinity, because Trent doesn't know what the scriptures actually teach. And what we're learning through a lot of this debate and discussion is that many Roman Catholics are woefully ignorant on biblical theology and the basics of biblical theology.
Question difficult for people to discuss is that many people have a very narrow definition of worship. Worship is just giving God all the honor God is due. And so
that is not what worship essentially is. That's a very broad statement that you could say, okay, yeah, we give God the honor. But how do we give God the honor in the way that God lays down? This is why Roman Catholics always argue against Protestants, that Protestants are essentially failing at worship because they don't have a Eucharistic altar and sacrifice. Yes, Protestants believe that Jesus died on the cross and that was a sacrifice, but they have discarded that Eucharistic centrality to worship that's ongoing at an altar. And to most pop apologists in the Roman Catholic sphere, they love to make the argument that Protestants, therefore, do not really worship God. They might have a mental assent, but the actual holistic worship, which is the entire person, the entire being of the person, this is why the liturgy, both in the East and the West, includes the whole man. It's not just a mental assent, it's also actually eating God. It's actually partaking of. It's bowing down. It's crossing yourself. It's all of these actions that are including the physical body just as much as the mind. And Roman Catholics don't even have this. For Orthodox, the heart. Keep in mind, in the Roman Catholic system, there is no nous or heart doctrine. They don't believe that. They believe in the Augustinian and Thomistic idea that it's body and soul. And for them, soul is essentially primarily identified with the intellect. So for them, salvation is ultimately an intellectual vision of the divine essence. This is known as the beatific vision. This is why for them, when they talk about worship, it's in that context of a mental assent to a vision of God's essence ultimately. That's the highest form of worship. For the Orthodox, that is not the highest form of worship. We do agree that there is an intellectual faculty in man, but we think that, as Romans 1 says, man's heart, as a result of the fall, is darkened. And the heart is not identical to the intellect or the mind. The heart is the innermost being, the spirit in man, which is why Paul talks about body, soul, and spirit. He lists three things. Roman Catholics, they only believe two. So, the whole man is deified. The whole man participates in worship, which is why we taste and see that the Lord is good. The fountain of immortality, as we sing in the liturgy. And why the whole body is involved in worship. Kissing, praying, kneeling, bowing. All of these things go into the holistic element of man being involved in worship, which is because the resurrection is not just an intellectual resurrection. It's a resurrection of body and soul and spirit coming back together after death. Thus, the body plays a key role in the eschaton and in the resurrected state. These people don't really realize that, because for them, the eschatological state is an intellectual vision of the divine essence. For the Orthodox, there's a new heavens and a new earth, and it's mirrored and patterned on the resurrected body that you see at the end of the Gospel of John that Jesus possesses. Jesus has a new body that walks through walls and that can appear and disappear, and yet he can still eat, and it still has physicality, even though it's deified flesh, according to St. Cyril of Alexandria. That's the deified flesh that we're eating in the Eucharist, which, by the way, disproves the Roman Catholics in the debate with Father Deacon Ananias, because they argue that you don't actually taste and see God in the Eucharist, because they're being consistent with their Thomistic theology that it's all created causal effects and not the actual uncreated divinity that you're participating in. I hope you see this, because all of this nonsense, the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, is simply illustrating the vast differences between the Orthodox view and these other pagan systems. And I will include Rome in the pagan systems. It should be evident now and on display for everyone, all the things that I've been telling you for the last 10 years The entire internet religious world is able to now see this, that Rome has a severely heretical and deficient position on all of these topics, whether it's the anthropology and restricting man to a body-soul duality and leaving out the heart, or whether it is participation in uncreated grace with their official created grace doctrine, or whether it is the natural theology position that leads to the perennialism that they're all end up defending now, or whether it's the magisterial contradictions amongst the papal documents, which they ignore or explain away or just hand wave or just say it doesn't count. This is the rot of this system that I've been telling you about for so long. And people are now beginning to see it and figure it out. And they're going into damage control. And every time Cameron and his goober crew does another podcast and another stream, they just keep tripling down, and it gets even worse for them. In fact, Trent Doherty is saying that Muslims have the gospel. Wow. If that doesn't show and tell you that this system leads to this blindness and darkness, there's nothing that will tell you that.